At the very edge of Alaska, where the icy wind snatches hoods off heads and the air smells of salt and fish scales, lived a solitary man named Jackson Harper. He was a marine biologist who had left behind a career in Seattle to study marine mammals in the Arctic. His cabin stood right on the shore, 20 miles from the nearest village, Kotzebue, and looked more like an abandoned station than a home. Jackson rarely saw people. His conversations were with gulls, seals, and occasionally, if he was lucky, walruses. He wrote reports, sent photographs to his research center, and warmed himself by the iron stove when the blizzards howled outside. One early morning, when the sun had just risen over the horizon and the snowy light cast bluish shadows across the ice, Jackson spotted something unusual on the shore. He stepped outside, wrapping himself in his fur-lined parka, and squinted toward the water. There, lying near the waves, was a walrus, massive, nearly 10 feet long, with majestic tusks and eyes filled with pain. The walrus was injured. A gash split its side, possibly from a boat propeller or, worse, a harpoon. Jackson approached slowly. The walrus didn't move, only swayed its head slightly, as if it understood this was not a threat, but a chance to be saved. The instincts of a scientist gave way to the instincts of a human being. Jackson rushed back to his cabin, grabbed a first aid kit, boiling water in a thermos, and warm blankets. He had no idea if it would work, wasn't even sure if he should be interfering at all. But something in the walrus's eyes, ancient and wise, wouldn't let him turn away. And so began a story that would one day capture the heart of an entire nation. Jackson spent hours of that day treating the wound. He boiled water, cleaned the gash with trembling hands, and stitched as best he could using the tools meant for emergencies, never for a creature this size. The walrus, surprisingly, did not resist. Its massive body heaved with slow, strained breaths, but it allowed Jackson's hands to work. It was as if something ancient passed between them, a trust forged in silence and snow. By sunset, the walrus was still alive. Jackson had dragged out a tarp to keep it dry and used thick canvas from his sled to cover part of its body. He didn't know if it would survive the night, but neither did he sleep. He stayed up, feeding the stove, stepping out every hour to check on the animal. Days passed. The wound began to scab. The walrus, whom Jackson started calling Solomon, began to stir, to shift its flippers, to grunt softly in the cold air. Jackson found himself talking to him, sharing stories as if Solomon understood every word. Maybe he did. There was something in those dark, wet eyes that felt familiar, almost human. Then came the first sign of danger, a snowmobile engine in the distance. At first, just a hum, then louder, closer. Jackson's heart sank. Only a few people ventured this far from Kotzebue, and most of them weren't researchers. He grabbed his binoculars and scanned the ridge. 2 men in heavy gear. Hunters. He stepped between them and the shore instinctively, his heart racing. Solomon, behind him, let out a deep, warning bellow. The snowmobiles came to a halt 30 feet from Jackson's cabin. 2 men dismounted. One tall and broad-shouldered with a hunting rifle slung over his back, the other wiry and younger, with a camera around his neck. Jackson recognized them from town, Ray Coleman and his nephew Eli. Ray was known for his aggressive stance on natural selection, claiming he hunted only to keep predator populations under control. Ray gave a mocking nod toward the walrus. "That yours, Harper?" he called out. "You know it's illegal to interfere with a wild animal out here." Jackson didn't move. His breath fogged in the air. "He's injured. I'm helping him recover." Ray raised an eyebrow. "And what happens when he recovers? You think he's gonna swim off into the sunset like some fairy tale? He's a 100-pound slab of ivory and meat. Be realistic." Eli looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one boot to another. He raised the camera slightly, then lowered it again. Jackson stepped forward. "I'm not letting you near him." Ray laughed. "You're not letting me? Out here? You're a biologist, Jack, not a ranger. And this is survival." For a tense moment, neither man moved. Solomon raised his head and released a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the frozen air. It was not the sound of a helpless creature. It was a warning. Ray's fingers hovered near his rifle strap, but Eli stepped between them. "Uncle, maybe we should go. The storm's coming in fast." Ray hesitated, eyes locked with Jackson's, then turned with a grunt. "Suit yourself. He won't last anyway." They mounted the snowmobiles and disappeared over the ridge, their tracks quickly swallowed by drifting snow. Jackson knelt beside Solomon and exhaled shakily. That could have gone worse. Solomon's eyes blinked once, slow and calm. That night, the storm arrived with the fury of a freight train. Winds screamed across the tundra, battering Jackson's cabin and coating every surface with a layer of ice. Snow came sideways, horizontal sheets slamming the windows, howling through the cracks in the wood. Jackson did everything he could to secure the shelter for Solomon. He'd already reinforced the tarp with extra layers of nylon, dragged out a portable heater powered by the solar battery, and used snow to bank the sides for insulation. Still, the cold was brutal. He sat inside, listening to the roar, heart aching with worry. At one point, around midnight, he stepped out into the maelstrom with a flashlight. The wind tore at him, the cold bit through his gloves. He made his way to the shelter. Solomon was still there, barely visible under the snow-drifted canvas, his breath rising in heavy clouds. His eyes found Jackson's, and the man felt something jolt through him. Not fear, not even sadness. Recognition. He reached out and laid a hand gently on the walrus's thick, snow-dusted head. "You're stronger than anything out here, aren't you?" Solomon made a low, soft sound. Not a growl this time, but something like acknowledgement. In the morning, the world outside looked alien, buried in white, silent and sparkling under a pale blue sky. The wind had vanished, leaving a stillness that felt earned. Jackson brought out fish he had thawed and laid them in front of Solomon. The walrus ate slowly, methodically. His eyes followed Jackson the entire time. That day, Jackson made a decision. He wasn't just going to help the walrus recover. He was going to protect him, no matter what. And that evening, as he sat by the fire, sipping lukewarm coffee, Jackson picked up his notebook and wrote one line at the top of a new page. Solomon is not just an animal. He's a story that demands to be told. As the days passed, Solomon grew stronger. His wound had begun to heal properly, and the swelling around the injury subsided. Jackson continued feeding him fish, talking to him like an old friend, and taking notes. Not just scientific observations, but personal ones. The bond between man and walrus had become something deeper than caretaker and patient. One morning, Jackson opened his email to find a message from his old colleague, Dr. Marissa Lane. She worked at the University of Washington and had helped him get funding years ago. Her subject line read, "Still alive out there?" He replied with a short message and a single photo. It showed Solomon looking directly into the camera, snow dusting his tusks, Jackson's gloved hand resting on his head. Marissa's response came within the hour. "Is this real?" Then a second email. "Can I come up? I want to meet him." Jackson hesitated. Letting people in felt risky, but he also knew the world needed to see what he saw. A creature not just surviving, but communicating. A week later, Marissa arrived on a supply plane, bundled in 4 layers of fleece in disbelief. "He's huge," she whispered when she saw Solomon. Jackson nodded. "And peaceful, if you don't threaten him." They spent hours beside him. Marissa recorded video, took measurements, and spoke softly to the walrus. To her surprise, Solomon responded to her presence, not with the same familiarity he had with Jackson, but with calm. By evening, Marissa turned to Jackson with wide eyes. "You know this could change things, right?" she said. "Conservation programs. Public funding. He's a symbol now." Jackson looked out at Solomon, who was watching the ocean as the sun sank behind him. "I don't want him to be a symbol," he said quietly. "I just want him to be free." Within days of Marissa's return to Seattle, the footage of Solomon went viral. A short clip of Jackson feeding the walrus in the snow, Solomon blinking slowly as if understanding, was shared on social media, news sites, and even morning television. People around the country were captivated, not just by the animal, but by the strange, quiet man who had given up everything to save him. Donations poured into wildlife foundations. Activists rallied to protect the area. Journalists began calling, asking for interviews. Jackson refused them all. "I'm not interested in turning this into a spectacle," he told Marissa over a patchy satellite call. "But it's already a spectacle," she replied gently. "The world sees hope in him, Jack." Not everyone was hopeful. 2 days later, a ranger named David Riker flew in from Anchorage. He stepped off the bush plane with a clipboard in hand and a government patch on his shoulder. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. Over coffee in the cabin, David laid it out plainly. "You're harboring a protected species, technically interfering with his natural behavior. There are rules, Jackson. I'm trying to keep him alive. I believe you, but you need to start thinking about next steps. If this becomes political, it could end badly. For both of you. Outside, Solomon let out a low rumble from beneath his shelter. David glanced through the frosted window. I'm not here to take him, not yet. But this can't go on forever. Jackson said nothing. After David left, Jackson walked down to the shore and sat beside Solomon. The walrus rested his enormous head near Jackson's knee, eyes half closed in the fading light. You might have to leave soon, Jackson said softly. I don't know where you'll go, but I'll help you get there. Solomon didn't answer, of course, but somehow Jackson felt heard. Spring came to the Arctic slowly, like a promise whispered across melting snow. The ice cracked and thinned, the air turned wet and heavy, and seabirds began to return, circling above the thawing coastline. Solomon stood now with effort, but with strength in his limbs. His wound had fully closed, a scar tracing the side of his great bulk like a memory carved into skin. Jackson watched him from the ridge above the shore, pride and dread tangled inside him. It was time. Jackson spent the morning loading supplies into his sled, dried fish, medical packs, flare guns. The plan was simple. Lead Solomon south along the ice shelf until they reached deeper waters. Waters where the walrus could swim, rejoin his kind, and hopefully disappear from the news cycle forever. No cameras, no applause, just release. As Jackson walked beside the walrus across the frozen shoreline, he couldn't help but speak, even knowing no one answered. You've made me see everything differently, he said. I thought I came here to study the wild, but really, I think the wild studied me. Solomon grunted low, his tusks shining in the rising sun. They traveled for 2 days. On the third morning, Jackson heard it. The sound he'd hoped for. Distant bellows from beyond the fog. A pod of walruses, calling. Solomon paused. His ears twitched. Then, for the first time since he'd been wounded, he moved with certainty, his heavy body lumbering faster toward the sea. Jackson jogged beside him, his breath catching in his throat. At the edge of the water, Solomon turned. Just once. His eyes met Jackson's, deep, dark, and grateful. Then he plunged forward with a great splash, vanishing into the surf. The man stood there for a long time, alone again on the shore. Then he smiled. Weeks passed. The ice broke up completely, and the land turned green in places. Migrating birds returned in droves, and the coastline hummed with new life. Jackson stayed in his cabin, alone again, but not the same man he'd been before Solomon came ashore. He kept writing, filling pages of his notebook not with data, but with memories. The way Solomon blinked when he was listening, the exact sound of his breath during that first night, the look in his eyes before he dove into the sea. Marissa called often, updating him on the world beyond the ice. You've become a symbol, she said once. There are petitions. People want to name a preserve after him. Kids are painting walruses in school. Jackson smiled softly. Good, but don't let them turn him into a cartoon. Too late, she laughed. He's got a fan club now. David Riker returned briefly, this time only to shake Jackson's hand. You did something remarkable, he said. That walrus shouldn't have survived, but he did, because of you. I didn't save him, Jackson replied. He saved me. One night in mid-May, Jackson walked down to the water with a flashlight. The tide was low, the stars were out, and for a moment, just a heartbeat, he thought he heard it. A bellow in the distance, a deep, echoing call from far beyond the surf. He stood still, eyes closed, letting the sound settle inside him like a song he never wanted to forget. When he opened his eyes, the ocean was quiet. But he smiled anyway. Solomon was gone. And yet somehow, he would always be there. In every wave, in every gust of wind, in the silence between heartbeats. The wild had given Jackson its trust, and Jackson had given it everything.